If you see me shivering tomorrow, do not bother digging a grave, because the frost in this valley will have already turned my bones to stone before your ration. Shovel can even bite the earth. These grim words were often whispered by the oldest settlers of Pine Ridge, Minnesota, during the dark days of 1884. It was a place where winter did not simply arrive. It invaded, sweeping down from the barren Canadian plains like an unstoppable army of ice and wind. For those who had chosen to make their home in time, this isolated valley, survival was a daily negotiation with the elements, a relentless struggle, where the margin between life and death was measured in the thickness of a cabin wall and the dryness of a woodpile. Among those struggling to find their footing in this unforgiving territory was Lucas Rostad, a silent and hard-working immigrant from Bergen, Norway. Along with his wife Karen and their two young children, 8-year-old Elsa and 5-year-old Christian Lucas, had spent the previous year trying to carve out a life on his homestead. Lucas was not a farmer by trade, nor was he a traditional grade frontiersman. He was a man of quiet contemplation, someone who looked at the world through the lens of structure and balance, preferring to study a problem from every angle before committing his hands to labor. His family's home was a modest cabin, constructed from local spruce logs, measuring 18 feet wide by 28 feet long. To the untrained eye, it looked like a sturdy shelter, built with the same techniques that had served frontier families for generations. But as the winter of 1883 had brutally demonstrated, traditional methods were failing under the unique pressures of the Minnesota climate. The log walls, though thick, were highly vulnerable to draft. The green timber of the frontier was prone to shifting and shrinking, creating microscopic gaps that allowed the freezing winds to probe every corner of the home. The cold in Pine Ridge was a creeping, invasive force that defied the simple defenses of chinked timber. Every morning, Karen would wake to a reality that was as discouraging as it was dangerous. She would find a thick layer of frost, coating the iron nails driven into the walls, and the children's breath would hang invisible, icy clouds above their beds. Elsa and Christian spent their nights huddled together under every wool blanket and heavy quilt. The family owned, yet they still woke up with their fingers numbed and their lips pale. Lucas would spend his nights stoking the stone fireplace, waking every 2 hours to throw more wood onto the coals. But the heat seemed to vanish almost as quickly as it was generated. It rose to the high ceiling rafters, slipped through the microscopic gaps in the moss and mud chinking, and escaped into the dark winter night. Meanwhile, the cold air from the frozen ground would rise through the gaps in the floorboards, keeping the floor of the cabin at a temperature that was barely above freezing. By the time dawn broke, the family was exhausted, having spent their sleeping hours fighting a desperate, losing battle against a draft that never slept. Lucas knew that they could not survive another winter like the last one, and he knew that simply burning more wood was a path that would eventually lead to exhaustion, illness, and ruin. The true crisis of the Pine Ridge winters, however, was not the design of the cabins themselves, but the state of the fuel that was meant to keep them warm. Cutting and splitting firewood was the lifeblood of the settlement, an exhausting task that consumed the autumn months and demanded the strength of every able-bodied man. Lucas, along with his neighbors, would spend weeks in the Plash forest, felling massive pines, trimming their branches, and hauling the heavy trunks back to their homesteads, using teams of horses that struggled to find traction on the frozen, uneven terrain. But splitting the wood was only half the battle. Keeping it dry in a climate that was constantly shifting was a nightmare that seemed to have no solution. The standard practice in the valley was to stack the cordwood on the north side of the cabin, protected by a simple sloped wooden overhang or covered with heavy canvas tarps held down by large river stones. In a dry, consistent cold, this might have been sufficient, but the weather in southern Minnesota was a volatile beast, characterized by sudden freeze-thaw cycles and damp, heavy snowfalls that penetrated even the tightest covers. When the warm Chinook winds blew down from the mountains, they would melt the top layers of snow, turning the surrounding landscape into a slushy bog. This moisture would seep downward, dripping through the gaps in the tarps and soaking into the porous fibers of the stacked firewood. When the temperature inevitably plummeted again hours later, the wet wood would freeze solid, locking the entire solid wood stack into a single, icy mass that required a splitting maul and an iron pry bar, just to separate a few logs for the morning fire. Lucas watched his neighbors struggle with this reality every single day. He saw how their fires would hiss and steam when the damp wood was thrown onto the hot coals. Instead of producing a bright, clean flame that radiated warmth throughout the room, the wet logs would smolder, releasing a thick, acrid smoke that filled the cabins and made the children cough through the night. To understand the real cost of this struggle, one must look at the thermodynamic behavior of moisture. When you try to burn wood with a high water content, the action fire must first spend its energy boiling away the water trapped inside the cells before the wood fibers can actually begin to combust and release heat. A log with a high moisture content, which was the average for most outdoor stacks in the Tasses, Pine Ridge loses nearly 40% of its heating potential to this process of evaporation. The heat that should have been warming the children's feet was, instead, disappearing up the chimney as useless steam, leaving behind a thick layer of sticky creosote that threatened to spark a devastating chimney fire at any moment. Lucas realized that they were burning twice as much wood as they needed to, simply because they had no way to protect their fuel from the sky. But Lucas Rostad was not a man who was easily discouraged by traditional limitations, and his mind was constantly working, drawing upon a lifetime of experiences that his neighbors could not begin to imagine. Before he had crossed the Atlantic to seek a new life on the American frontier, Lucas had spent 15 years as a shipwright in the historic port city of Bergen, Norway. There, amidst the salt spray and the constant wind of the North Sea, he had learned the delicate art of working with wood under the most demanding conditions imaginables. In Bergen, he had worked on the construction of double-hulled wooden fishing vessels designed to navigate the ice-choked waters of the Arctic Circle. The old master builders in those yards had taught him a fundamental truth that would stay with him forever. Wood is a living, breathing material, and its greatest enemy is not the water itself, but the lack of air. If moisture became trapped between the inner and outer planking of a ship's hull with no way to circulate, the wood would develop dry rot within a few seasons, destroying the structural integrity of the vessel from the inside out. To prevent this, the Norwegian shipwrights used a technique they called luftspalt, a deliberate, carefully calculated air gap between the two layers of the hull that allowed the wood to breathe and dry out naturally through the wood-dadio movement of air currents. As Lucas stood in the freezing wind of Pine Ridge, looking at his drafty spruce cabin and his soggy wood pile, a sudden, brilliant realization began to take shape in his mind. He realized that his cabin was suffering from the exact same physical phenomenon that destroyed poorly ventilated ships: the collision of temperature extremes. When the heat from the stone fireplace warmed the interior air, that warm, moisture-laden air would migrate outward through the log walls. The moment it met the frozen surface of the outer logs, which were in direct contact with the plexstack sub-zero wind, it reached its dew point. The water vapor would condense into liquid water and ice, trapping dampness inside the timber and chilling the cabin through conductive cooling. If you are enjoying this story of frontier engineering, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more weekly survival secrets. And do not forget to tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Lucas's plan was as simple as it was revolutionary. He would not attempt to build thicker walls or trice up his cabin with more mud chinking. Instead, he would build a second, lighter wooden shell that would completely encase his entire cabin, leaving a generous 4-foot air gap on all sides. This outer shell would act as a massive shield, intercepting the wind and the snow before any allay they could ever touch the logs of his home, while the 4-foot corridor between the two structures would serve as a protected, ventilated space where he could store his firewood, allowing it to season and stay dry under the ultimate cover. It was a design that challenged every rule of frontier construction, but to De Lucas, it was simply the application of a North Sea truth to a winter in the closed, wild territory. In the early autumn of 1884, as the leaves of the birch trees began to turn a sea, brilliant gold, and the morning dew started to freeze into a delicate crust on the grass, Lucas Rostad began his project. He started by clearing a 4-foot perimeter around the entire foundation of his spruce log cabin, measuring the distances with a length of knotted hemp rope and marking the corners with heavy, wooden stakes driven deep into the earth. His plan required him to construct a complete, secondary wooden building that would wrap around his home like a second skin, a project that would demand an enormous amount of physical labor and a significant portion of the family's modest savings. To secure the structure against the powerful winter winds that swept through the valley, Lucas had to dig 24 vertical post holes, each one sunk 4 feet deep to reach beneath the frost line. He filled the bottom, each hole with coarse river gravel to facilitate drainage and prevent the wooden posts from rotting, then set heavy pine logs into place, tamping the earth down around them until they stood as straight and solid as the trees in the forest. The financial cost of this project was a heavy burden for the young family, amounting to nearly $290 in lumber, hardware, and nails that Lucas had to purchase from the local mill. This sum represented nearly half of the money they had saved to establish their homestead, and the 48-7 project would consume 48% more lumber than the original cabin itself had required timber that could have been used to build a proper barn for their livestock or sold to provide a safety net for the coming year. Corinne Rostad watched the steady depletion of their savings with a quiet, nesting anxiety that she kept hidden from the children. She knew that if Lucas's design failed, they would be left without resources in a land that showed no mercy to the poor. But despite her worries, she chose to stand by her husband, carrying water to mix the mortar, helping him hoist the heavy rafters into place, and maintaining a steady, encouraging presence that kept the children calm. Lucas worked with a bright-note, quiet, tireless focus, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent his life shaping wood. He framed the outer walls using rough-sawn pine boards, overlapping them vertically in a pattern that would shed rain and snow like the scales of a fish, while leaving the natural texture of the wood unfinished to allow it to breathe. The roof of the outer shell was designed with deep, 4-foot eaves that extended far beyond the walls, creating a wide canopy that would carry shedding snow and rainwater far away from the foundation of both the inner cabin and the outer shield. Die! By the time the first real cold snap of October arrived, the permanent skeleton of the outer shell stood complete, a massive, imposing wooden cage that completely swallowed the familiar outline of the Rostad cabin, leaving only the stone chimney projecting through a double-layered iron collar at the peak of the station's roof. To those who rode past on the valley road, it looked like a monstrous, half-finished barn that had mistakenly been built over a home, a visual testament to what many assumed was the complete loss of Lucas Rostad's senses. The true heart of Lucas's design lay not in the wood itself, but in the invisible behavior of the air that filled the 4-foot gap between the cabin and the outer shell. This space might have looked like nothing more than a drafty, useless corridor, but to Lucas, it was a finely tuned thermodynamic machine that operated on the natural laws of pressure, temperature, and moisture movement. The first key to the system was the elimination of direct wind impact. When a 1.com south cold wind hits a standard single-walled cabin, it creates a high-pressure zone on the windward side, forcing cold air through the microscopic gaps in the windward, chinking and pulling heat out of the logs through convective cooling. By enclosing the cabin in a secondary wooden shell, Lucas ensured that the wind's energy was absorbed entirely by the outer boards. The air within the 4-foot corridor remained almost completely still, creating an insulating blanket of dead air that functioned exactly like the double-pane windows of the modern era. Because still air is an exceptionally poor conductor of heat, the rate of thermal transfer through the cabin's spruce logs was reduced by more than 60%. But Lucas knew that a sealed air gap would eventually trap moisture, leading to the devastating condensation problems that his neighbors had warned him about. To prevent this, he incorporated the natural principles of the stack effect, the tendency of warm air to rise and cold air to sink. He cut a series of small, screened ventilation ports near the ground level of the outer shell and larger, adjustable vents near the peak of the outer roof. When the fireplace inside the cabin was lit, a small amount of heat would inevitably leak through the log walls and the insulated ceiling into the 4-foot corridor. This leaked heat, though not enough to warm the outside world, was sufficient to raise the temperature within the corridor by several degrees above the outdoor air. Because warm air is less dense than cold air, would naturally rise toward the roof vents, creating a gentle upward draft that flowed continuously over the surfaces of the cabin logs and the stacked firewood. This movement of air created a localized zone of low pressure near the floor, which automatically drew in dry, cold air from the ground-level vents. The result was a continuous, passive ventilation system that carried away any moisture that escaped from the cabin before it could reach its dew point and condense into ice. Lucas used this dry, moving air corridor to store his entire winter's supply of firewood. He stacked 3 cords of split pine vertically along the inner prime surface of the outer shell, leaving a 2-inch gap between the wood stacks and the walls to allow the air to flow freely. The warm, dry air rising from the Dakin corridor would pass over the split logs, carrying away their residual moisture and accelerating the seasoning process. In effect, Lucas had built an automatic wood dryer that ran on nothing but the wasted heat of his own home. It was a self-regulating system that maintained its own balance, a beautiful demonstration of how a simple understanding of physics could solve a problem that had defeated generations of builders. The reaction of the Pine Ridge community to Lucas's project was swift, loud, and entirely dismissive. The frontier was a place where conformity was often equated with common sense, and anyone who drifted too far from the established path was viewed with a mixture of suspicion and amusement. The ringleader of the skeptics was Gunnar Crow, the settlement's master carpenter, a man who had built dozens of cabins in the region and whose word on construction was considered law. Gunnar was a large, boisterous man who prided himself on his practical experience, and he found the site of the Rostad project to be a source of endless humor. That Norwegian is building a coffin for his own house, Gunnar would roar to the men gathered at the general store, gesturing with a thick, calloused finger. He's got twice the wall, twice the roof, and when the process dampness gets trapped in that gap, his logs will rot so fast he'll be sleeping in a pile of sawdust by next autumn. Mark my words, a house needs to breathe to the outside, not to an empty shed. The other builders in the valley quickly joined in the chorus of disapproval. Thomas Vance, a veteran lumberjack who had spent 30 years in the woods of Maine and Minnesota, shook his head when he saw the structure. "It's a complete waste of good timber," Thomas muttered. "A man who doesn't trust his own chinking has no business building a home. If he'd spent half that lumber on a 70-proper barn, his cows wouldn't be shivering in the wind." The skepticism quickly trickled down to the rest of the community, turning into a social pressure that began to affect the Rostad family's daily life. At the slant, weekly church services, preacher Seth Wick delivered a sermon on the dangers of vanity and the importance of wise stewardship, dropping pointed hints about those who wasted their resources on extravagant, unproven structures, while their neighbors focused on practical survival. Karen Rostad felt the weight of this judgment every time she walked into the Procyon settlement for supplies. She would see the other women whisper and turn away when she entered the general store, and during the quilting circles, she had to endure the patronizing sympathy of Martha Crow, Gunner's wife. "It must be so difficult for you, Karen, dear," Martha would say, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "With Lucas spending all your savings on that barn house. We're all praying that you don't freeze when the real cold sets in. My Gunner says it's a shame to see a family's future thrown away on a whim." Corinne would tighten her grip on her sewing needle, her face burning with embarrassment, but she refused to let them see her doubt. "Lucas knows what he is doing," she would reply, keeping her voice as steady as she could. "We will see what Winter has to say." But the most painful part of the isolation was how it affected the children. Elsa and Christian would return from the settlement schoolhouse in tears, telling their mother how the other kids had made fun of their shed house, calling their father a crazy old man who was afraid of the wind. Lucas would sit by the fire in the evenings, listening to his children's quiet crying, his face remaining as calm and unreadable as a stone wall. He did not get angry. He did not defend his design, and he did not attempt to argue with Gunner or the preacher. He simply held his children close, patted his wife's hand, and continued his methodical, step-by-step preparations for the winter. He knew that the only language the frontier truly understood was the language of results, and he was willing to wait for the snow to speak for him. The winter of 1885 had been relatively mild, a gentle season that allowed the Prosendection skeptics to maintain their laughter and enabled Lucas to quietly refine his ventilation system. But as the calendar turned to 1886, the weather patterns over the northern plains began to shift, preparing a test of structural integrity and human endurance that would dwarf anything the valley had seen in 40 years. The warning signs began on the morning of January 18th. The barometer in the Prove-Lee 18's general store dropped with a suddenness that startled the storekeeper, the mercury falling faster than anyone could remember. The wind, which had been blowing gently from the south, suddenly died, leaving the entire valley in a heavy, breathless silence that felt almost unnatural. The sky took on a dark, bruised hue, a pale yellowish-green tint that old-timers knew was the signature of an approaching Arctic monster. By noon, the temperature began to fall, dropping from a relatively comfortable 15 degrees above 0 to 0 in the span of 2 hours, and then continuing its downward slide into the negative numbers with terrifying speed. And then, the wind returned. It did not blow in gusts. It slammed into the valley like a solid wall of iron, a sustained, screaming gale from the northwest that quickly reached 50 miles per hour, with gusts that exceeded 70. The wind brought with it the snow, not the soft, heavy flakes of a normal winter storm, but a fine crystalline dust that was as hard and sharp as ground glass. The wind-driven snow reduced visibility to 0 within minutes, turning the surrounding landscape into a shifting, white void where a man could lose his way between his back door and his well. The National Weather Service would later record this event as a bomb cyclone, a rare and devastating meteorological collision that pulled a massive mass of dry, Arctic air directly down from the polar ice caps and slammed it into the moist, low-pressure systems of the Midwest. The temperature outside the Rostad cabin continued to plummet through the afternoon, dropping to a bone-chilling -41 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature so extreme that exposed skin would freeze and develop severe frostbite in less than 90 seconds. The wind chill, which factored in the relentless velocity of the gale, approached an unbelievable -75 degrees. It was a killing cold, the kind of weather that didn't just challenge comfort, but actively sought to destroy life. Lucas stood at the window of his inner cabin, looking through the dry, frost-free glass across the 4-foot air gap to the outer wooden wall. He could hear the outer shell groaning and creaking under the immense pressure of the wind, the pine boards rattling against their frame, as the storm battered the powered structure with relentless fury. But inside the cabin, the air remained perfectly still. The candle on the kitchen table did not flicker, the children's breath did not fog, and the family sat in a silence that was protected from the screaming chaos of the world outside. While the Rostad family sat in their protected shelter, the rest of the Pine Ridge settlement was descending into a state of desperate, freezing panic. The storm had caught many families unprepared, their wood piles low and their cabins unready for a sustained siege of such extreme intensity. The cold was a relentless, searching enemy, probing every corner of their homes, finding every microscopic gap in their chinking, and pulling the warmth out of their rooms with a brutal efficiency. At the home of Gunnar Krog, the master carpenter who had laughed loudest at Lucas's design, the situation had quickly turned critical. Gunnar had built his cabin with the finest materials and the tightest joints he knew, but his single-walled spruce logs were no match for a 41 below zero wind. The wind stripped the heat from the exterior surface of his walls almost instantly, creating a conductive bridge that drew the warmth out of his living room faster than his massive stone fireplace could replace it. Gunnar's family huddled together in their winter coats, wrapped in every quilt and blanket they owned, their faces pinched and pale as they crowded within 3 feet of the roaring fire. The far corners of the room had dropped to 8 degrees above zero, and a thick layer of white frost had begun to form on the interior surface of the log walls, creeping upward from the baseboards like a frozen fungus. But worse than the cold was the state of Gunnar's firewood. His outdoor pile, stored under a canvas tarp that had been ripped away by the 50-mile-an-hour wind during the first hours of the storm, was completely buried under a place for 5-foot drift of packed frozen snow. To retrieve fuel, Gunnar had to struggle through the blinding whiteout, risking his life to pry ice-logged logs from the powerment, drift with an iron bar. When he carried the frozen wood inside, it was wet and soaked through with rime. When he threw it onto the fire, the log hissed and sputtered, releasing a thick, choking cloud of black smoke that filled the cabin and made his children's eyes water. The chimney, chilled by the sub-zero exterior temperature, began to collect a dangerous buildup of wet creosote, which restricted the draft, forced even more smoke back into the room. Gunnar's family was faced with a brutal, terrifying choice: crack open a window to let out the smoke and lose their remaining warmth, or keep the cabin sealed and suffocate in the dark. Down the valley, Thomas Vance's family had run out of dry wood by the second night of the storm. In a state of quiet desperation, Thomas was forced to break up his oak dining bench and his children's bed frames with an axe, feeding the dry furniture wood into his cook stove in an effort to keep his family's fingers from freezing. Across the settlement, water pipes burst, water buckets froze, solid on kitchen tables, and the silent, terrifying fear of hypothermia settled over every household. The proud, experienced builders of Pine Ridge were being humbled by a winter that cared nothing for their experience or their pride. Inside the Rostad home, however, the experience of the blizzard was altogether different. The transition from the frozen hell of the exterior world to the calm class interior of Lucas's cabin was a journey between 2 entirely different seasons. While the storm raged outside, the air inside the cabin held a steady, blissful warmth that felt like a gentle summer afternoon. Karin Rostad woke at 3 o'clock on the morning of the third day of the storm, her mind prepared for the familiar, shivering dread that had characterized her winter mornings for as long as she could remember. She braced herself as she slid her legs out from under the blanket, expecting her feet to touch a floor that was as cold as ice. But as her bare soles met the oak planks, she gasped in quiet surprise. The floor was warm, actually and genuinely warm to the touch. There was no draft whistling under the door, no freezing current of air sweeping across the floorboards to chill her ankles. She walked to the window and looked out. In their old cabin, the glass would have been coated in a thick, opaque, the sheet of ice that blocked all visibility. But here, the double-paned window was completely dry and clear, showing only the dark, protected corridor of the brick 4-foot gap and the neat, dry stacks of firewood standing ready along the outer wall. Karen walked into the children's room. Elsa and Christian were sleeping deeply, their small bodies covered by only a single light wool blanket. Their cheeks were a healthy, rosy pink, and their breathing was deep and regular, free from the wet, rattling cough that had haunted their winters in the past. Lucas sat by the small cook stove in the kitchen, reading a book by the warm glow of a kerosene lamp. He looked up as Karen entered, a quiet, gentle smile brushing his lips. "You should be asleep, Karen," he said softly. "I couldn't sleep," she whispered, walking over to stand beside him, resting her hands on his shoulders. "I was waiting for the cold." "The cold cannot find us here," Lucas said, gesturing to the wall. The stove, which required only 2 small split logs of bone-dry pine every 4 hours, was running at maximum efficiency, its firebox glowing with a bright, clean intensity that produced virtually no smoke or creosote. The dry wood, stored in the protected, ventilated gap of the outer shell, had seasoned to perfection, releasing its thermal energy completely without wasting a single BTU on evaporating water. The stone chimney, kept warm by its double-shell design, drew perfectly, carrying the clean exhaust up and out of the cabin without a single puff of smoke entering the room. The temperature inside the cabin registered a steady 68 degrees Fahrenheit, a full 20 degrees warmer than any other home in the valley, and Lucas had achieved this comfort while burning less than a third of the wood his comfort neighbors were consuming. As Karen looked at her husband, the residual anxiety that had haunted her for months vanished, replaced by a deep, overwhelming wave of relief and pride. She knew that the community had laughed. She knew that they had called him a fool. But as she listened to the peaceful breathing of her warm children, she knew that Lucas had saved them all. On the morning of January 24th, the great storm finally blew itself out, leaving Pine Ridge buried under a silent, dazzling desert of snow. The drifts on the Rhine, north side of the valley, reached 12 feet high, and the silence that settled over the Thunglurn was heavy and profound. As soon as the wind dropped below 10 miles per hour, Gunnar Krogh stepped onto his porch. His face was pale and drawn. His hands were cracked and bleeding from handling frozen, wet wood, and his body ached from a week of shivering in a Wungen cabin that had barely stayed above 35 degrees. He looked across the Machens, snow-covered fields toward the Rostad property, expecting to see a scene of devastation. Perhaps a collapsed roof, or a chimney choked with ice, or a family huddled in their barn in a desperate attempt to stay alive. With a sense of grim duty, Gunnar strapped on his wooden snowshoes and began the long, exhausting trek through the waist-deep snow to check on the family he had so publicly mocked. As he approached the Rostad homestead, he noticed something that startled him. The massive outer wooden shell of the building showed no signs of damage. Its aerodynamic, curved roof had shed the heavy snow loads perfectly, and the drifts had piled up harmlessly on either side of the teared structure, leaving the main entrance completely clear. But it was the chimney that drew his attention. A thin, barely visible trail of white smoke was rising from the iron pipe, a clean, steady draft that suggested a highly efficient, clean-burning fire within. Gunnar reached the outer door, and Kummels knocked, his heart pounding with an uncomfortable mixture of apprehension and pride. The door was opened by Lucas. Gunnar stared, his tongue sticking to the roof of his mouth. Lucas was standing in his doorway wearing nothing but a light cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. His face was relaxed. His skin was warm, and he did not show a single sign of the freezing ordeal that had left the rest of the valley looking like survivors of a shipwreck. "Gunnar," Lucas said, his voice carrying the same quiet, unpretentious tone he had always used. "Come in. You look cold." Gunnar stepped through the outer airlock door and into the cabin, and the cabin was announced. Transition struck him like a physical blow. A wave of dry, clean warmth, fragrant with the smell of dried pine and freshly baked bread, enveloped his body. He stood in the kitchen, his eyes wide as he looked at the wall. Thermometer, 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Karin was standing at the counter, preparing lunch in her regular house dress, and the children were playing on clean, warm wooden floor, without a single blanket or coat in sight. Gunnar stood there, his snowshoes dripping onto the floor, and for the first time in his life, the master carpenter of Pine Ridge had absolutely nothing to say. But Gunnar Crow was not merely a proud man. He was an honest craftsman who respected the truth of physical structures, and he could not let his own embarrassment stand in the way of understanding what he had just witnessed. "Lucas," Gunnar said, his voice quiet and humbled, "I need to know how this is possible. I have built cabins for 20 years, and my own home was a freezer this week. If you will let me, I want to study this. I want to measure everything." Lucas nodded, a gentle expression in his eyes. "You are welcome to look, Gunnar. The wood does not lie." And so, for the next 3 weeks of February 1886, Gunnar became a daily visitor to the Rostad property, bringing with him a scale, a dry bulb thermometer, and a notebook to document the performance of the double shell design. He began his investigation by crawling into the 4-foot air gap corridor, carrying a kerosene lantern to inspect the inner and outer walls. He examined the logs of the cabin with a rigorous, step-by-step attention to detail, looking for any signs of the condensation and rot he had predicted. To his surprise, he found the spruce logs to be perfectly dry, the surface smooth and warm to the percent touch, with absolutely no trace of frost, mold, or moisture buildup. The ventilation ports near the foundation and the peak vents were working exactly as Lucas had calculated, creating a gentle, continuous movement of air that carried away the cabin's leaked humidity before it could reach its due point. Next, Gunnar turned his attention to the stored firewood stacks. He selected random pieces of split pine from different levels of the stack and weighed them carefully on a merchant's scale. He then carried them to a heated room, dried them completely in an oven, and weighed them again to calculate their precise moisture content. The results were stunning. The wood stored in the ventilated air gap had a moisture content of exactly 13%, a level of dryness that was almost impossible to achieve in an outdoor stack, even during a dry summer. By contrast, samples Gunnar took from his own outdoor pile tested at 32% moisture, meaning his wood was essentially carrying a third of its weight in frozen water. Gunnar then monitored the temperature fluctuations within the corridor over 24-hour periods. He discovered that the air gap acted as a powerful thermal buffer, maintaining a temperature that was consistently 15 to 20 degrees warmer than the outdoor air, even when the fire inside the cabin was allowed to burn low. This buffer effect reduced the rate of heat loss from the cabin's inner walls by more than half, allowing the family to maintain a proscent, comfortable 68 degrees with only a fraction of the fuel. Gunnar sat at Lucas's table, his notebook filled with columns of figures, his fingers tracing the mathematical relationships between moisture, airflow, and heat retention. The evidence was irrefutable. Lucas had not gotten lucky, and he had not built a sweatbox. He had engineered a highly organized, beautifully balanced thermal machine that worked with the laws of nature to protect both the home and the fuel that kept it alive. On the evening of February 24th, the Pine Ridge Cattlemen's Association called an emergency meeting in the settlement's community hall to discuss the aftermath of the storm and the state of the valley's resources. 37 families attended, crowding into the drafty room, their faces worn, their conversation centered on dwindling woodpiles and livestock losses. Gunner Crow stood to deliver his report, but before he could speak, Thomas Vance, who'd been one of the loudest skeptics, called out from the back. I know we had it hard, Gunner. But what about the Norwegian? Did his double box freeze out like we said? Gunner looked around the room, then turned to the blackboard. He picked up the piece of chalk, and began writing down the comparative data he had collected over his 3-week investigation, presenting the numbers with a stark, undeniable clarity. He showed that the Rostad cabin had maintained an average indoor temperature of 68 degrees, while the conventional cabins struggled to reach 54. He revealed that Lucas had burned just 0.8 cords of dry pine during the entire month, while Gunner's own cabin had consumed more than 2.1 cords of wet, frozen wood. He wrote down the fuel moisture percentages, pointing out that Lucas's koi sat at a perfect 13%, while the standard outdoor piles were choked with 29% water. Finally, he compared family health, noting that the Rostad children had experienced 0 sick days, while nearly every other household in the valley was dealing with severe croup or pneumonia. The room fell into a heavy, stunned silence as the families stared at the roll figures on the board. The difference was not a matter of minor adjustment. It was a total transformation of efficiency. Lucas's family had used 62% less wood to maintain a temperature that was 14 degrees warmer than the finest conventional cabin in the valley. Gunner Crow stepped forward, his voice carrying a quiet gravity that commanded the room's attention. I have built homes in this territory for 20 years, Gunner said, looking directly at the assembled families. And I have told you, all that my way was the only way. I stood before you at Christmas and laughed at Lucas Rostad, calling his work wasteful and crazy. I was wrong. I was completely and utterly wrong. He paused, letting the words settle over the silent crowd. Lucas did not build a monument to vanity, and he did not waste his lumber. He understood the behavior of wood, air, and heat in a way that none of us had the humility to consider. While my family spent the storm shivering under blankets, choking on smoke from wet koi, his children were warm, healthy, and safe. His house is not frosting, a mistake. It is the smartest piece of engineering this valley has ever seen. We did worse than laugh at him. We let our own pride blind us to a truth that could have saved our families from suffering. I owe Lucas Rostad an apology, and this community owes him its respect. The silence that followed was broken not by argument, but by a quiet murmur of agreement that quickly turned into a steady, respectful applause. The proud frontiersmen of Pine Ridge had been forced to face a reality that was colder than any winter wind, and they had found the courage to admit that they had been wrong. The transformation in the community's attitude toward the Rostad family was immediate and profound. There were no more whispers at the general store, no more patronizing comments at the quilting circles, and no more teasing of Elsa and Christian at the settlement schoolhouse. Instead, Lucas found himself the most sought-after man in the county, with a steady stream of neighbors arriving at his door, not to mock, but to ask for his help. They came with notebooks and measuring tapes, humble in their desire to understand how they could protect their own homes and keep their firewood dry for the coming winter. Lucas did not gloat, and he did not hold a grudge. He welcomed them all into his warm cabin, Karen serving hot coffee while Lucas sat at the table, patiently, sketching the structural details of the Luftspalt, explaining the stack effect in simple terms, and helping them calculate the proper ventilation angles for Fentine Amon, their specific properties. In the spring of 1886, as soon as the ground thawed, construction began on 7 new double-shell structures in Pine Ridge. Gunner Crow worked alongside Lucas, using his carpentry skills to refine the design, adapting the concept for larger families and different types of timber. By the winter of 1888, more than 20 homes in the valley had implemented the Blankenese Rostad method, and the settlement of Pine Ridge had become a model of frontier efficiency, its families warm, its cooey dry, and its children healthy through the reeking, coldest months of the year. The county surveyor, Arthur Pendleton, visited the valley in 1887, documenting the design for a report that was later published in the State Agricultural Journal under the title, The Double Shell Rostad Cabin, a Study in Vernacular Thermal Insulation. Lucas's quiet persistence had not only saved his own family, it had changed the architectural history of the region. Lucas Rostad lived in his double-shell cabin for 41 years, raising his children to adulthood and watching the valley he had helped save grow into a Deuce-7, prosperous, thriving community. He passed away peacefully in the winter of 1925, surrounded by his family in the warm, dry room he had built with his own hands. The cabin stood solid and sound for nearly a century, a monument to a quiet man who had the courage to trust the laws of physics when everyone else trusted only tradition. When the structure was finally dismantled in the 1960s to make way for a modern highway, the preservationists from the Minnesota Historical Society were astonished to find the inner spruce logs in nearly perfect condition, dry, free from rot, and as solid as the day they had been hewn, preserved by breathing blanket of air that Lucas had designed. Today, the principle that Lucas applied intuitively in 1884 has become the cornerstone of modern, energy-efficient architecture, known to building scientists as the rain screen or ventilated facade. This double-wall air gap is used in skyscrapers from New York to Tokyo to protect materials from moisture and reduce heating costs. But the true legacy of the Rostad cabin does not lie in the engineering manuals. It lives in the memory of a cold January dawn when a family woke up warm, dry, and safe, proving that sometimes the most revolutionary step forward is simply having the humility to remember what came before. This video presents a historically inspired reconstruction of 19th century frontier building techniques and thermodynamic principles for educational and entertainment purposes. While the thermal mass and ventilation concepts discussed are scientifically valid, modern construction must comply with current building codes, safety standards, and professional engineering guidance. Do not attempt to replicate historical double-wall or underground structures without consulting a licensed builder or architect to ensure safety and structural integrity.